We are MythVision. Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for being patient with your host, Eric Lambert. I'm bringing you Dr. Robert M.Price today, and we're going to be talking about some controversial contradictions. You know, many Christians come up and they have great explanations, and I can't help but say it. It's like they want to harmonize no matter what. Yeah, there were 3 women at the tomb, but this one says 2 because he thought it was important to only mention 2 of them and not 3 of them. And, there's always these not that important contradictions, so to speak, that Christians say is not really a contradiction. Well, Dr. Bob's going to bring to you guys some contradictions today. And I hope if you pay close attention, which I usually have to rewatch these videos just to learn from the very footage that I myself am hosting, Dr. Bob's going to bring up some stuff, so make sure you replay it and watch it multiple times to catch some of the details that this exquisite scholar, Dr. Robert M.Price, brings to the table. I love this guy. Make sure you guys go down in the description of the video, look at his YouTube channel, because I'm going to tell you right now, there's a couple out there, but the one that him and his wife are primarily going for now, and they're uploading ancient material, hidden podcast, stuff you guys have probably never even heard of prior to his Bible Geek days, you guys are going to catch on his YouTube channel. And go down into Amazon, type in his name, order his books. It really helps him out. Him and his wife are at home now, and this is what they do for a living. I love you guys. Let's get right into it. Dr. Bob, the contradiction himself. How are you, brother?
Oh, I like that, being an incarnate contradiction. Yeah. I'm doing great. How about you?
I'm trying to stay warm. It's 20, 30 degrees here in Washington State, and I said, you know what would warm me up? I think the pits of hell as we start to talk about the contradictions of the Bible. So who better than to bring you on?
Uh-huh. Yeah, that's why my theme song, my intro song on the Bible Geek is Highway to Hell. For a while, we didn't use it because some people said, well, that might be off-putting to some particular theoretical listeners that might be out there and be affronted by hearing this. And so for a while, I acquiesced and we used something else. And then I decided, oh, to hell with it. I'm going back to Highway to Hell. But the contradiction thing is always a fascinating and vexing question, because there are people who are hell-bent on trying to say, oh, no, there aren't any contradictions. Well, why is that? Because there can't be. And why is that? Well, it has to do with not faults in the Bible, but rather faults in some people's doctrine of the Bible. It seems to me that once you parade all of these contradictions, which I'm about to do, a selected list, that ought to tell you that you're, well, like one of my favorite theologians, Bugs Bunny, said, I made a wrong point in Albuquerque. Something's got to be wrong. I mean, if I could see maybe if there's like 1 or 2 of these things, you could say, oh, they're just puzzles. Like, for instance, in Deuteronomy, it's going over the various kinds of creatures are kosher for eating, and it says something about 4-legged grasshoppers or insects or something. And everybody who's not a fundamentalist always chuckles at that. So they, how stupid were these people? And anybody can see they have 6 legs. And I thought, I'm not sure if this is a contradiction, that this would be too stupid. I wonder if we're misunderstanding it, like Warfield said. You sure you've got it right? And then somebody told me that in fact, it's a question of whether you consider the huge back bowed legs as legs or not, and that some taxonomists in the ancient world apparently didn't think of them that way. Like when you say, I know I'm getting way off on this, but when you say crabs are arthropods like insects are, and one of the marks of this is that they have 6 legs, and you look at a crab and it's obviously got 8 appendages. What's going on? Well, they don't consider the 2 front ones with the huge pinchers as legs. Well, it turns out that must be what the author had in mind. You couldn't be that stupid to think that, not even to notice. Come on. So, yeah, maybe that's the case. Maybe you could explain one or two of them plausibly. But the problem is you have what I like to call a zoo full of monsters here. And it reflects not on the Bible. When you have a contradiction or an error, like the mustard seed not being the smallest of all seeds, if the problem isn't with the Bible exactly, it's not like the Bible writer was just an idiot. I mean, you're almost insulting the writer to set it up that way. Often contradictions tell us a whole lot that we wouldn't have known about the Bible otherwise. Like if they're two, as we'll see in a moment, there are contradicting accounts of how something happened, or different versions of somebody's story, and you can't squeeze them both together. That's not bad. That's good. It's telling. A great example of this. There are two versions of the story of Abraham and Hagar, and one of them implies that Ishmael, her son, was a baby when she went off into the wilderness with him, but another one implies that he must have been like 12 years old. And you think, what the heck? How can you get both these in? Or when there are three versions of this, when Abraham goes into Egypt and his wife is so beautiful, he's afraid the king is going to want her for his harem and kill Abe, get him out of the way. And so he has to lie and say, well, actually, she's my sister or something. But if you look back at the earlier stories about Abraham and Sarah, she's nearly 100 years old. What is the deal? The king is going to look at this old shell, this old hag, and say, hubba, hubba. I got to... Jeffrey Epstein in reverse. What the heck? Can the author have intended that? No. He obviously just patched various narrative scraps he knew from tradition or whatever, and he didn't want to leave anything out. And so whether he could, and sometimes you can see him trying to harmonize things, but sometimes just didn't occur to him, and the results are ridiculous. But it's not because the writer is stupid. It's because there's a limit to what you could do editorially. And once you realize that, you say, okay, I see what's going on here. But the Bible actually becomes more interesting because of it. And you're saving the Bible. You're delivering it from looking stupid.
I agree.
Mean, not to like about the Bible, but let's not just caricature it. And they don't mean to, but their theology forces them to.
If you don't mind me mentioning on that, Bob, because I definitely 100% agree with you. I've told people today, look, everyone can believe what you want, freedom of religion. I am a big fan of this, okay? However, when you start talking about it, you write this in your most recent book, the superstitious, okay? The superstition Christians, what they've done with the system surrounding the text, okay, is what I think makes the text look so ridiculous. Now, where I came in, and I don't want to we've got so much to cover, we're going to cover it, but I don't know if you could feel where I'm coming from. When I started transitioning out of Christianity and deconstructing, I wanted to somewhat protect the text. Now, what I mean by that is Paul claimed that a resurrection happened. In my mind, it either happened literally, as Christians want to say, or it didn't literally happen. And so in my head, I said, it's not either this or that. What if it literally happened esoterically? What if it was some type of not actual physical body out of the grave, so to speak, literally, but what if it was an allegory, the same way that supposedly Jonah literally got spit up out of the belly of a well, literally, and was literally swallowed. So that is what I try to do to justify and protect. What if this text has been abused by those who hold it so sincere and misrepresent maybe what the actual teaching context of it was? So that's something that was crossing my mind, and I don't know where some of this lies, but after listening to you and other scholars for a while, I'm stuck in this position where I go, somebody's got to be lying. You start getting later into these letters, it's like somebody's trying to do something. And I wanted to try and be allegorical. I wanted to try and give it the benefit of the doubt in every aspect I can. Is there that stuff going on? I'm sure. But is Paul's resurrection supposedly a real, literal, supposed claim? Or is this some allegory in the heavens? What's going on? And so I didn't want to offshoot, because I know you could probably do a show on this right here, but that's what I wanted to do when I heard contradiction. Was I wanted to somewhat protect the text. And today I don't think we're necessarily doing that, but you are saying this is better than trying to look silly and suggest this literally happened and this is what's going on. And anyway, I'm sorry, I had to rabbit trail and give you where I was at, and maybe you can touch on it.
Yeah, there are plenty of narrative contradictions that seem to denote a combination of different sources, because the writer or compiler just didn't care, or figured it's more important to squeeze in all the bits and pieces. But there are also instances where you really do have to wonder if the author meant something literally, like at the end of the Gospel of Matthew, the Great Commission, where Jesus says, go out and disciple all the nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Spirit. And lo, I'm with you always, even to the end of the world or the age. No ascension follows that. Who is he talking to? Surely it's to the readers. This isn't really even supposed to be a historical report, or the great story of the Emmaus disciples. When Jesus is there talking to them, they don't recognize him. He vanishes as he's consecrating the bread they're going to eat. What? How can you not think this is symbolic of the Eucharist, the Lord's Supper? It seems to me clearly a symbolic story, and that's to insist. Oh no, it really happened. That, I think, truncates the meaning of the story, or the multiplication of loaves and fish. Those stories seem to be Eucharistic stories too. Literally, Jesus is increasing the amount of food by hard to imagine means. Like, it's not just that, oh, maybe there was some physics involved, we don't know, but like David Friedrich Strauss said, what is it we're supposed to envision Jesus doing? Is he taking one of the fish or one of the rolls and pulling it like it's a sponge and tearing it apart, and then doing the same thing with each other? It just doesn't make any sense, because you're not really supposed to think of it that way. The point is mere bread. It's not mere bread, because there is spiritual nourishment in this far beyond the literal significance of the bread and the Eucharist. If you don't see that, it's just a freak show. It's just like, oh, here's an account of the abominable snowman or a UFO abduction. How would that, I mean, be interesting, but would it have any spiritual value? And so it seems to me that some of these things are not intended to be taken literally. John Dominic Crossan thinks none of it is. He thinks that it was all symbolic and allegorical, and that they figured that Christians would understand that, and they're stupid when they don't. I'm not convinced of that, but sometimes I think that is going on. Or like when Jesus says in John 20, do you believe because you've seen, he says to Thomas, and then you can just see him turning toward the audience and saying, blessed is he who believes without seeing. Obviously, he's breaking the fourth wall and talking to the reader. And how can you ignore this stuff? You're taking it literally when you understand the kind of text you're dealing with, and sometimes it is symbolic. Other times probably not, but that's very difficult. And of course, people don't like this to admit that there's this range of genres and types of writing in the Bible, because they don't want to miss out on certain literal miracles. They want to think of miracles as proofs for their belief, as if that has anything to do with faith. That's very strange to me that you're talking about some salvation through faith. What sort of faith is this? If you, oh no, I got to have evidence that demands a verdict. It seems very self-contradictory, speaking of contradictions. But here's another problem with contradictions. Broadly, evangelicals, conservatives like to say biblical authority means that the literal, as far as we can tell, the intended meaning of the author is binding on the believer. What it says you should do, well, do it. What it says is true, you should believe it. And so another way of saying it is the apparent sense of the text is authoritative. Now, why put it that way? Well, that's because Martin Luther was wisely trying to limit the scope of biblical interpretation. He's living in a time where medieval Catholicism can just get anything they want out of the text as if it were a Rorschach blot. Oh, yeah, it's not on the surface, but this is the deeper meaning. Now, that in itself was an ancient attempt to get the Bible out of a tight spot. Like when Origen says about the Garden of Eden, he says, no adult believes that a snake spoke to a guy. And he says, even in the Gospels, there are hundreds of historical absurdities. Well, what should you conclude? This is fun. No, you should realize that the author must be putting the red light on. Get it? You got to look deeper. There's something else going on here. Like I just try to give a couple of examples of. But once you say that that's possible, you're in, as I think Walter Bauer put it, a marshy bog. You don't know what's solid ground under your feet, and it can start meaning anything. Well, Martin Luther says, well, what do you get indulgences and this and that? Oh, well, it's not on the surface, but it's a deeper meaning. You're just making it into a ventriloquist dummy. So Martin Luther tried to say, no, it's the plain sense of the text, not the weird esoteric meanings.
And you think that harmed? Do you think that in a way that he's trying to do something he thinks is right, of course, but doesn't that also possibly put something? And I think this is important for our audience who's watching. Could we jump right into these contradictions? Oh, of course. Could you go into them? But I like what you're doing because there's a prerequisite to getting into these contradictions I think are important and laying the ground right here, like genre, all this stuff. And Martin Luther's trying to say plain reading of the text, but what if the plain reading of the text, as Protestants have done so well on saying it literally, they've got literal helicopters being locusts that are flying in Revelation. So the plain reading of the text tells me what looks like a locust, a modern day helicopter. So there's damage that can be done by the plain literal reading of some of these things. I think are you suggesting that maybe there is that, yes, the medieval Catholic Church is abusing things to their own, of course, gain and many other things, but isn't there this plain reading of the text can be harmful as well from really getting to the possible meaning?
Well, it can, but that's a really interesting case because what even the fundamentalist is doing there is to say, this is not a genre to be taken literally. Anybody can see that it's filled with cipher language. And if they know enough about it, they can say there are other ancient apocalypses like 4th Ezra and so on, or parts of Daniel and Zechariah that are obviously supposed to be symbolic about upcoming historical events. So they're willing to say, yeah, just like the Psalms are not literally true because they couldn't be. They're not making claims about history or anything. They're not telling stories, really. Same thing with Revelation. Surely this means something esoteric that the author figured you could get, right? This calls for wisdom. Let him who has wisdom count the number of the beast, for it's the number of a man. In other words, you know who I mean. You can figure it out. And why ever they did that. So they figure, well, yes, I'm trying to discern the author's intent, and it's not a genre that's to be taken literally. But the Gospels, they're straightforward narrative, presumably they are. And that I don't think they've looked into it deep enough as critical scholars have. They start saying, well, there are earmarks of this, something else is going on here, like I just gave examples of. But the really fatal thing about the plain sense of the text is, you know how apologists will say, well, you call this a contradiction, but it's only an apparent contradiction. That is, it seems that way, granted, but if we really try hard, we can figure out how somewhere both are true. Or even if we can't, one day we'll get to heaven and they'll have a huge seminar taught by angels saying, well, I know you've been waiting to hear how the heavenly voice at the baptism said both. This is my son, and you are my son. Well, here it is. And he goes, hey, son of a gun, why didn't I think of it? And so they're saying it's, as far as we know, it's an apparent contradiction. Well, wouldn't that be the worst kind if biblical authority is a matter of the apparent sense, the plain sense of the text being normative? If it's on that level that the contradiction exists, we're screwed. Right? What are you going to do about divorce, for instance, if it seems like Matthew allows it but Mark doesn't? You're up the creek there. And so apparent contradictions have to be the worst kind, according to the way they view biblical authority. They never seem to realize this. Or sometimes they'll just say, well, in a case like that, we do have to retreat to what I would call far-fetched, but they'd say figurative or allegorical readings. Martin Luther understood that if you did that, you're opening Pandora's box, because then you can start thinking that it means something esoteric even when it doesn't contradict. So then you're going to be believing in the assumption of Mary and papal authority and all that. So there's another reason that this attempts to iron out the contradictions, because it can't contradict. It's the word of God. No, you're barking up the wrong tree. You got to go back to the drawing board. And I admit that is also a Pandora's box, as witness all the attempts of well-meaning, more liberal scholars to find some locus of biblical authority. I did a whole book on that. It was my theological dissertation. It was published by Prometheus under the title Inerrant the Wind, where I try to show how there are about 5 different attempts of modern evangelicals to admit, okay, the Bible is not inerrant. There are factual mistakes and contradictions, but if you define biblical authority this way, okay, that ought to work. Well, there are about 5 ways, and I try to show how they're all borrowed from other kinds of theology, and they all have implications that evangelicals have always tried to avoid. And this goes to show that Harold Lindsell and others were quite right when they said, if you start questioning the inerrancy of the Bible, you're going to wind up in some sort of liberal or Catholic Christianity. I tried to show, yeah, he was right. It is a slippery slope, but you got to be as honest with the Bible as you can. I have a book I'm going to be working on pretty soon, I hope, called When Gospels Collide. I have the series of books with these sci-fi titles like Night of the Living Savior and The Amazing Colossal Apostle. I've been thinking of this one for a long time, and what I want to do is just with the Gospels take a bunch of contradictions and say, why do these differ? What is the point? They differ because one writer has changed it from a previous one, but what's he getting at? And often you can tell. Some of them still stump me, but I look forward to trying to make sense of that. Like, why do the Gospels contradict as to who Peter is speaking to in the courtyard when he denies knowing Jesus? Is he speaking to a soldier, a servant girl, and the crowd, or is it a servant girl, another servant girl, and so on? None of the Gospels have the same three. Why would anybody change that? I still haven't figured that out, but that's the kind of thing I want to deal with. And most of them, I think I can. And I'm trying to say these aren't just goofs. Like you can show how the resurrection, the empty tomb narratives, don't just contradict as if some idiot couldn't get his story straight. It's very clear to me how one changes the other and why. That's pretty easy to see, but you're not gonna see it as long as you got the blinders of biblical inerrantism. You just making it look ridiculous. And so I'm open to do that book. By the way, I've also got a book that's pretty close to being finished, where I've written a bit of it, but John Loftus and I are editing it, called Varieties of Jesus Mythicism, where we're going to have chapters on the sacred mushroom theory, the astrotheology approach, the mystery religion approach, Gnosticism, the sacrifice in heaven instead of on earth, and a bunch of things. It's very, very impressive by impressive writers. So that's still some months away, I'm sure, but that ought to interest our audience, I think.
Mm-hmm.
But if we want to actually get into some of the contradictions,
yes. Time to get into the mill. I'm going to mute, and this is going to I'm going to actually change the screen up where you're shown. And I actually just thought it was important to kind of bring up a small little prerequisite so people can kind of go, man, you can go anywhere with this. You can kind of, there's a couple different ways. And anyways, I look forward to what you have to say about this, Dr. Bob. This is where I mute.
Now, let me ask you, I need to bring up on the screen the list I'm working from, which means I won't be able to see this screen, but I hope you can still see me. Let's see.
You're good. Yep, okay. You're good.
Oh, okay. Well, going back to Genesis, here's the first one about the order of creation. Genesis chapter 1 has God create plants. This is in verses 11 through 12. And then various animal species, and that's in verses 20 through 25. And then finally, at the end of the process, he creates men and women, verses 26 through 27, apparently several of each, just like with the animals, the birds, the mammals, beasts of the field, and all that stuff, groups, okay, and not one specimen of each. Okay, so, and the last one is humanity. But in Genesis chapter 2, we have a completely different order of creation. First, in 2:7, God makes a male human, the Adam, which just means human being, without specifying it further, like anthropos in Greek, or mankind or whatever, okay? Then he plants the Garden of Eden. That's verses 8 through 9. And he's going to have the Adam be the caretaker for that. And apparently it's God's garden where he and the other gods implied earlier in the story get their sustenance. It's verses 8 through 9. And only then the animals in verses 18 through 20. Now, why does he even make the critters? Well, to keep the man or the human being company, because apparently it wasn't very time consuming to tend the garden, get rid of the weeds and so on. And he figures the man needs company, so he tries to create some other life form that would keep him company. And that's why he makes the animals and brings them one by one to the man, and he gives them names and so forth. I think I'll call you an orangutan and so on. And then it doesn't work. God's experiment has failed, but we did get all the animals out of it. Apparently, it's because they can't speak, like in a Tarzan movie, right? Well, Tarzan somehow communicates, but they can't speak, but they're his company. And he decides, well, because everything he makes from the ground as he did the Adam is too different. And so finally he says, maybe I'll have better luck, as we might say, cloning him, and takes a piece of him and makes another human. This one, of course, is just called the woman until the very end of chapter 3. And then that's where all the trouble starts and so on. But you can't get these two together. It's a violent contradiction. Did he make plants and then animals, then human beings? Or did he make a male human, or an androgynous one possibly, then the plants, then the animals, as a kind of an afterthought? Good luck trying to iron that out. So you could say, well, I guess the Genesis writer just was an incompetent hack and he couldn't remember what he had written. No, if a number of factors, stylistic, etc., make it clear. Chapter 1 has what we call the priestly creation account, the 6-day creation, but chapters 2 and 3 have the J or Yahwist account, which has the Garden of Eden and one man and one woman, unlike the priestly, which has a bunch of them, right? And there are various other differences there, but that's a very clear contradiction. And again, understanding why it's actually in there makes, to me, I've said it many times, that there's nothing more pious than understanding the text. And so I think once we do, once we admit there are contradictions, it helps us to understand what the Bible's getting at. But most people, of course, don't want to. I mean, they think they do, but the thing is, they're just reading it for edification, and to do that, they think they have to believe everything in it, and for that to be possible, it all has to agree, and it just doesn't. So if they want to understand the Bible, you got to go back to the drawing board. I could go on to Cain and his wife, but would you like to discuss that at all?
If you think that you have something unique and different that you think you can bring to the table for the audience, because I think most people who've looked into contradictions have said, well, where did he get his wife? Like he's the first.
I meant the Eden versus the 7-day creation, but yeah, I do want to.
Okay, yeah, sure. Feel free to go into whatever you want to go into. I'm here for the ride. I'm taking notes.
Okay. Well, shortly, after they learn the secret of procreation, then they're named. By the way, it's not clear. By the way, the rabbis pointed out that the shift between Adam, human being, and what the man and the woman are called once she emerges from his side, they're called the Ish, the male, or the man, and Isha, the woman, almost like in English, the man, woman, Isha. And then there, from there on in, that becomes a proper name for the man. He is Adam, and then he names the woman Eve. And that's the name of a mythological mother goddess in several of these Mediterranean religions. And then they mate and they have a son. The first one is Cain in Genesis 4:17. Where did Cain get his wife? There's a classic stumper. Who is she supposed to be, since we've only been told about Cain, and it's a big deal that he's the first human actually born as we are? Well, let's see. Did they have a daughter, and that's not mentioned, and that so that his wife is his sister? Then you got questions like, did God suspend the incest taboo, as well as any bad genetic effects? There's a big problem there. I mean, especially if you want to take it literally. Sacred incest? Well, why bother with this when you can more naturally explain it in terms of the narrative being a patchwork, because there are clues in the rest of these little Cain episodes that are all strung together that they were originally set in different historical periods, because there was like a Cain cycle where, he's envisioned in different places and times. For instance, and in these, he is not the first human infant to be born into an empty world, because he builds a city in 417. Who's going to live there? I mean, it doesn't say he builds a house, he builds a city. Can't be like one of 3 people alive on the planet. Similarly, who is it he thinks is going to kill him in 4:14? And this is where God gives him the mark, so that anybody who sees him will say, uh-oh, we better not screw with this guy. You know who that is? Look at the mark. That's Cain. He's a terrible killer. Who's he afraid of? Is he afraid his parents are going to come after him and kill him? It clearly means that there's loads of people around. And what's the mark? Well, it has to be a tribal or clan tattoo that a particular rival non-Israelite clan has, that identifies them as fierce warriors and tells everybody else to back off, steer clear of them. And he is imagined as the, well, we would say mythical ancestor of the Canaanites. The name Cain is related to that. And so it's just like, this is almost as old as the Cain story now, but if you've ever seen Xena Warrior Princess, a big show in the 90s, Xena was sort of a female Hercules, and she's going all over the Middle East and Europe. In antiquity, it never says exactly when, but if you compare all the episodes, in one of them, she meets Hercules several times. Then she meets Galen, the 2nd century AD physician, and she meets Mary and Joseph headed for Bethlehem. She is involved in the Trojan War, and there's several. She meets King David and Julius Caesar. How long did this woman live? Was she like the wandering Jew? She lived on age after age? No, it doesn't intend that. The point is that, she lived way back then. Let's imagine the adventures she could have had in general antiquity. Well, that's the way, and that was the way it was with Hercules. Herodotus tried to figure out when Hercules must have lived, and he gave up because Hercules is mentioned in different stories that imply different historical settings. Well, in the same way with Cain, there are various Cain stories that imagined him living in different periods. So was the writer just an idiot who couldn't keep the story straight? No, he's a compiler who's trying to save every little bit of sacred narrative he could gather. So you're vindicating the Bible when you understand it this way. I mean, and on the other hand, what the heck? What kind of spiritual value is there in just taking it all literally? I mean, that's quite a burden. Oh, yeah, I got to believe everything in biblical narrative really happened or I'm going to hell. What's the point of that? I mean, not that anybody in the New Testament ever says things like this. Does Paul say, if you confess with your mouth that Cain murdered his brother Abel and believe in your heart that happened, you will be saved? No. Does he say, if you will believe that Jesus walked on water, you'll be saved? No. Nobody ever says anything like that in the Bible. But they all wrap it up in one big bag. You got to believe this or you're out of here. No Christian would doubt that. So the pressure's off if you look at it this way. And again, I'm not trying to just make it easy for people. I'm trying to make the Bible understandable, something that's good in its own right, rather than making it a hostage to a theological scheme that only caricatures it. Well, and it's amazing how some of these are never noticed, seemingly. Like, here's another goodie in the same chapter, Genesis 4, verse 2. It says that Abel is the first shepherd of humanity, presumably, and that Cain is the first farmer. And, you know, that's the occasion for the trouble with their offerings, that Abel is wise enough to give God meat, whereas Cain gives him a veggie burger, right? The fruit of the ground. Obviously, God has superior taste. He's a meat eater. But then in verse 20, we go into this, one of the big genealogies of the pre-flood people. Verse 20 says that a different guy was the first herdsman, Jabal or Jabal, depending on how you prefer saying it. He is said to be the first nomadic herdsman, and then his brother Jubal, from which we get jubilation and jubilee, he's the first musician, and that both fit shepherding nomad culture. But in Genesis 9:20, Noah is the first tiller of the soil. How can that be if Cain was? Oh boy. So what's the deal there? Well, simply that there were different stories that have just been stitched together kind of arbitrarily, and they didn't want to leave one of them out. And so, but good luck. I mean, you could say that, well, Noah started, maybe he rediscovered agriculture after the flood. Now, it doesn't say that. It says that back when it says that Cain was the first farmer and so on, we're seeing him depicted as a culture hero, the founder of this lifestyle that is still going on. There's nothing about it being interrupted by a world-destroying flood. It doesn't say that Noah was the first tiller of the soil after the flood. No, it's just, again, a patchwork of fascinating patches. Speaking of the flood, though, how long did the flood last? Was it a total of 150 days? Well, that's what Genesis 7:24 says. Or did it last only 61 days? That is, with 40 days of continuous rain and then 3 weeks of drainage with the sky clear. Now, that's what it says in Genesis 8:6-12. Which was it? I mean, I don't know that anybody has had the chutzpah to say, well, it did last 150 days, but the writer was only interested in 61 of them. You know, are you joking if you say that? Does anybody even say it? I don't know. Or maybe they just kind of hope you won't notice. The moderns, I don't mean the biblical writers. And similarly, in this story, how many animals did Noah bring on board? Did he bring a single pair of every animal species? Well, that's what it says in 6:19 verses 20. Or did he bring 7 pairs of kosher animals? That is, he could slaughter and eat some of them while the ship was afloat, with only 1 pair of non-kosher ones. Just Porky and Petunia Pig, no other ones, because he's safe. They're not going to eat him. That's in 7:2-3. Well, the solution to this is, in principle, simple. It takes a little unraveling, but it works amazingly well. You've got, again, the J account and the priestly account, just like you do in the creations, right? But these 2 flood stories are not placed one after the other like the 2 creation stories are. Why would that be? Why not treat them the same way? Well, simply because both of these stories end with God pledging never to flood the world again. Well, if you put one after the other, the reader would have to think, no sooner does he promise that he's not going to flood the world, then we crank the thing back up and he floods it again. That's what it would look like, right? And so no, we're going to have to splice the two together. And you can pretty easily disentangle them, partly by consistent uses of either Elohim or Yahweh as the divine name, and partly by grouping these details together. Like how many days, how many pairs of animals, and you can come out with two consistent flood stories that are largely parallel but have slightly different details. That shouldn't be any big surprise because we have several extra biblical accounts of the flood. The Gilgamesh epic has one. The Atrahasis epic has one. The myth of Deucalion and Pyrrha in Greek mythology, and loads of other ones, actually. I have this satirical little book I wrote some years ago called The Politically Correct Bible, like the Bible as it would read if it were written by modern liberals. And one of the gags in it has, as the waters recede from the flood, the hull of Noah's Ark bumps up against a traffic jam of other arks from the Sumerians and the Babylonians and the Greeks, and they realized different gods told them all about the flood moment. But there were enough of them to do that. So once again, if you disentangle it, you have insight into how the Bible was compiled, and you absolve any of the authors of making just stupid remarks. Now, you still got implausibilities, like the writer could not have had any idea how many species there are on Earth. He couldn't have he couldn't have known that a world flood would end all life forever, since it would have deoxygenated the water and suffocated the fish, and there goes the food chain. How would he know that? He didn't. Why blame him? How could he have gotten kangaroos from Australia and penguins from Antarctica and so forth to put them on the ark? And he didn't know they existed. And how could he have kept the critters from eating each other? How would he know that for a giraffe to survive an ocean trip like that, you would have to create a huge leather sling to keep them upright, and so they didn't know this. They couldn't have known this. That's not a problem if you just look at this as ancient literature, it doesn't make them stupid, and it doesn't make God look stupid by saying he told them to say this. He'd have known better, but then why didn't he say? Well, he didn't say. It's just more scraps of ancient mythology. And so again, the Bible comes out smelling like a rose once you take the critical approach, not the fundamentalist one. I remember one day in church, the one I pastored, they had the kids sing this creepy song about Noah and the flood, and how God put the rainbow in the sky afterward, and they called the song Rainbow Valentine. And I remember thinking, now let me get this straight. God has just wiped out the whole human race except for these 8 people. We ought to call the darn song Rainbow Epitaph. But people, they know what it says, but they just don't care. And so they're not reading the real Bible. As Clark Pennock once said, the fundamentalists don't like the Bible they've got, so they're implicitly rewriting it. Well, if you press on to later in Genesis, poor Joseph, the smart alecky kid who tells his brothers that, oh, by the way, I tell you, I'm going to rule all of you one day. And Brad, let's get rid of this kid. They throw him into this pit, and he's sold into slavery, and they go home and say, gee, Dad, the funniest thing happened on the way home. Joseph, your favorite, was ripped apart by animals, and here's this great T-shirt you gave him with all the colors, and then what happens? It says that he's pulled out of the pit by the Midianites, some traveling Midianites, their neighbor Canaanites, who sell him to another neighboring tribe, the Ishmaelites, and they sell him into Egyptian slavery. That's Genesis chapter 37, verse 28. But in chapter 37, verse 36, it says the Midianites themselves sold him as a slave once they got into Egypt. Well, I know apologists would like to say, well, 6 of one, half a dozen of the other. They're just kind of telescoping the events just to shorten the story. That might be true, but then again, you're simply explaining why the narrative is not correct. Right? And that might be, but there's a whole chain of these things where it's you got Potiphar playing a role in one version and Potipharah in another one, and there's sort of similar circumstances, etc. And it becomes pretty plain once you're looking for this that you've got two different Joseph stories that the compiler tried to put together as best he could, but had to wind up leaving off the end of one of them because he couldn't have it come out two different ways. So a problem, again, solved by a critical approach. I like to ask people, which approach to the Bible is the better one? One that solves problems or creates problems? And it seems to me the critics win the prize on that. Now, here's another great one that prompts exegetical gymnastics. When did people start calling God Yahweh or Jehovah? The one is just based on the Germanic spelling. Was it in Enosh's day back in Genesis 4:26, that is before the flood? Or was it only once God appeared to Moses at the burning bush in Exodus 6:2-3? It actually says in the first one that in Enosh's day, men began to call on the name of Yahweh. But in Exodus, God says to Moses, well, he says, who are you? Who do I tell the Israelites sent me? Which kind of means he wasn't a monotheist yet. Right? Which one of the gods are you? And he says, I am that I am. And this is an elaborate pun. Tell them that I am has sent you. Tell them that Yahweh has sent you. Because they're trying to explain the name Yahweh is based on the Hebrew for Hayah, to be. But at any rate, one makes it pretty clear that they couldn't have been calling him Yahweh because and then later on in another version of the same scene, he says, I wasn't known to your fathers as Yahweh, but as El Shaddai. But from now on, I want to be known as Yahweh. Well, what about poor Enosh? Well, the writer just didn't know about that. Again, it's a patchwork quilt, a scrapbook of different sacred traditions. I mean, why are there the two different versions of the revelation of God at the bush to begin with? Did he think Moses had forgotten what he told him the first time? It looks stupid if you insist that it's all one writer and that God pretty much dictated the whole thing to him.
I agree. I love that one. In fact, came across that one not too long ago, and the whole idea, to me, if it's just a speculation, but I was listening to Dr. William G. Deaver, I believe it is. He's an ancient archaeologist. He's obviously more skeptical. He actually made a statement, pretty bold statement, that the Old Testament archaeology that people are claiming is like good, this proves the Bible. He says, like, there is almost nil to none that actually is literally, in fact, based off of the Old Testament, like where it talks about there were no more high places in one location. Well, they have found high places in these locations, and these are not high places that are like modern according to the time that the book's claiming these things took place. No, these things were existing, and that there were no more high places. Oh, well, what's the person going to say? Oh, well, they stopped using them. Well, what if they destroyed the high places? Then how come there's still high places in the places they say were destroyed? Anyway, I'm rabbit trailing, but he makes a statement that the name is put in there as this progressive idea. They're changing gods. So now we've got to imply now Yahweh's being put into the narrative. So he wasn't called Yahweh or known as Yahweh to your fathers, but he's revealing himself as Yahweh now. It's the same God, though. Really, it's multiple different gods that they're now overlaying into the text to go from polytheism to monotheism.
That's right. Deaver's certainly correct. I mean, I feel like an idiot, as if I know better. I approve. He's right. But I've been convinced by that as well. And it turns out, because of archaeology, that not only were various gods called El, which apparently means strong one, the etymology of it, but that there were that Yahweh itself was a kind of a common name for different gods, which kind of explains how one of the prophets says that sacrifices are offered up to him all over the world. People have wondered, how can that be? If Israel was the only one that knew him, well, they weren't. At least they had gods named that. That was even another name for Baal, who was the son of El in Canaanite mythology, just as Margaret Barker points out, Deuteronomy 32, 34, somewhere in there, it distinguishes between El Elyon, the Most High God, and his son, one of his sons, Yahweh. Well, that comes right out of Canaanite mythology too. And what they're trying to do there with the high places is part of a broader redactional agenda throughout the Old Testament, to say that here's the way the past should have been, so let's portray it that way. And it's like the Ministry of Truth in 1984 by George Orwell, and it's like what these idiots are doing today, and trying to destroy every vestige of the Confederacy and so on, because we wish there wasn't this slave owning bunch of states. So there weren't. It's what some of them call a usable past, which just means propaganda and fictionalizing. But that was, I mean, the very distinction between the Israelites and the Canaanites seems to be another case of that. The Canaanites, who are shown tempting Israelites into worshiping their polytheistic gods with their orgies and their images and idols and stuff, it seems pretty clear this was simply an earlier stage of Israelite religion. And once they had the so-called Deuteronomic reform, they wanted to rewrite history and say, well, our ancestors were around and they were guilty of Canaanite worship pretty often, actually. Can't really hide that. But why? Well, they must have been corrupted by those no-good Canaanite neighbors. So they've just scapegoated their ancestors, making them into the alien Canaanites, and pretending that their ancestors were good Orthodox Jews, as in the Reformers' own day. I mean, that goes on all over the Bible. And it makes more sense of it, it seems to me. Though, of course, I realize why people are affronted with that, because as many of these minimalists, and I don't know if Deaver goes quite that far, but it's the same sort of tendency, there just isn't any reliable historical narrative in the Old Testament until you get to at least names of real kings. The house of Omri and so on that are mentioned, what I like to call the latest and most boring parts of the story. Not Noah and David and Solomon and these people, but all of that. The idea that there were ever two kingdoms, Israel and Judah, seems not to be the case. The idea that there was a Solomon's temple at all seems to be a fiction, because there's zip archaeological evidence for these things where there would have to be if they really had existed. What, God sent a bunch of angels with vacuum cleaners to get rid of all the detritus, like New York after a ticker-tape parade or something? It's just, there's this crowing that apologists like to do about how biblical archaeology proves the accuracy of the Bible. Snap out of it, pal. Read a book that's long over with. That's been totally credited. In fact, it's exactly like they're in the same boat with the Mormons, because they made these claims about Israelite refugees that got to the Western Hemisphere and came the Nephites and the Lamanites and all that stuff. Well, that's not absurd on the face of it, but it turns out there simply is no evidence of these civilizations in the North American continent. And then worse yet, genetic tests, once they were invented, shows that there is no Semitic blood in any American Indian they can test. Well, that just blows the whole boat out of the water for the Mormons. The same thing has happened with conservative evangelicals and fundamentalists. They'd like to believe the sacred history, but it's just not true. And the approach to take, by the way, is what one Mormon elder, I don't remember the name, said about this, which one would imagine to be absolutely devastating to Mormonism. He says, well, I guess the real question here is not so much are our stories true, but are we true to our stories? Okay, somebody's got some brains. If you say, yes, they're fictional stories, but they're stories of nobility and faithfulness and piety. All right, there's no problem then.
I didn't mean to interrupt you with I like that you side trail into that. That was interesting. All right, I'm going back to the, you're on the View now.
Let's see. This has to do with what I call the resilient bovines. How many times did the cattle of the Egyptians die from the Exodus plagues? If you look at Exodus 9:6, then verses 18 through 26, and then in chapter 12, verse 29, apparently they all died 3 times. It doesn't just say some cows were killed by the plague or the sleet and all this stuff. It says all the cattle of the Egyptians were killed, though those belonging to the Israelites were not. I mean, that's pretty explicit. Where'd they buy a whole bunch more in the meantime? It just seems like, again, the 10 plague narrative is a patchwork of different versions of the Exodus plagues. And some sharp-eyed scholars said, hey, if you look at a couple of the Psalms that recount the saga of Israel, 2 of them do mention, 2, maybe 3, mention the plagues and list some of them, but though they overlap, they don't match. And it looks like whoever was compiling Exodus had the different lists in front of him and just decided to combine them all, even though the redundancy, messed it up. I'd sort of rather think that than that the Bible meant that God resurrected the cows. They brought a whole bunch more in from Texas or something like this, which it never suggests, right? I mean, if that happened, it's an odd thing to leave off stage. And nothing suggests it. So, yep, we got a better explanation with the patchwork theory. Now, here's a goodie. When did King Saul first meet David? Well, we got 2 different versions, both in the book of 1 Samuel. Was it when Saul recruited David as a musician to ease his seizures, his possession spells? because David played the lyre, and he found the music hath charm to soothe the savage breast. That's in 1 Samuel 16:14 through 23. So he hired David as a musician. That's it. But according to chapter 17, verses 55 through 58, Saul had never seen David before. He met him as a servant of his father, of David's own father, Jesse. He came to bring some food to his brothers who were in Saul's army, encamped across the valley from the Philistines. And they were in a tight spot because Goliath of Gath, who was 6.5 feet tall, unlike the shrimpy Israelites and everybody else pretty much in that day. He's saying, hey, we don't all have to die here. Let's just have a contest of champions. Send out your best guy and I'll beat him, and that's it. We won. Well, they figure this guy is head and shoulders above us. He's like a superhuman. What are we going to do? And Saul didn't want to go out, and David hears this, and he says, Your Majesty, it's a question of tactics. I care for my father's sheep at home, and that means I have to reckon with lions and bears. No, I don't go up against them mano a mano. I use this nifty sling and shoot them in the head, basically, with a stone. That's all it'll take. I can wallop this Philistine braggart the same way. Just give me a chance. And he does, and you know what happens? He slings the rock. It pierces the forehead of Goliath. It was like a gunshot in the head, and he falls down dead. Dave grabs Goliath's sword and chops his head off, and boy, does this make him a hero. And Saul says, okay, you're my number one warrior now. And then it gets even weirder after that. But which was it? Did he hire him as a lute player or a mighty warrior? When did he meet him? And of course, it's simply a matter of patching together different stories. And this feeds right into the question of who killed Goliath. Just mentioned that in 1 Samuel 17:48 through 51, it's David, right? But in 2 Samuel 21:19, it says, no, it was Elhanan, whoever he is, he's never mentioned again, one of David's soldiers when he was king. He killed Goliath. And it's not just two guys of the same name. They're described in the same way. Well, what's going on here? How are you going to get out of this? Well, the King James translators fudged and said, Elhanan killed Goliath's brother. Yeah, that's the ticket. But that's not what it says. They're just trying to, get out of a tight spot. And so it's obvious what happened was, who the hell's Elhanan? He did this great deed. Nah, let's say David did it. I mean, he's the great hero. And so they simply attributed it to him. But whoever was compiling the Deuteronomic history didn't feel he could leave either one of them out. I mean, the same thing would have happened that did when the Revised Standard Version was first published in, I think, 46 and 52, something like that, where they relegated certain passages to the footnotes, saying, we have a lot more manuscripts nowadays, and we can tell these little bits weren't in the oldest ones. It looks like they've been added, so we're relegating them to the bottom of the page. Oh, man, did this make fundamentalists mad. They had book burning parties for the RSV. Well, yeah, that's the psychology of it. People have heard these stories. Hey, why didn't my favorite get in there? And so it's not at all hard to see why they thought these things had to be harmonized or at least preserved without leaving anybody's favorite stuff out. Like a kid in a bedtime story. Yeah, Daddy, you forgot about the one where the ogre becomes an insurance salesman. Go back.
Does this also play into the same notion in 1 Samuel, 2 Samuel with Satan or Satan and David, who entices, well, one is God entices David to number Israel. The other one says Satan entices David to number Israel, or something to that aspect. And it's an apparent contradiction.
Though this is an interesting one. This is right on the borderline. In Samuel, I guess it's 2 Samuel, where it says that Yahweh suggested that David take a census of the military. And apparently that was a big mistake because it meant he didn't trust God. You know, like some trust in horses, some trust in chariots, but we will call on the name of our God. You find that in Psalm and Isaiah and so forth. Like it's sort of like the Boxer Rebellion. Hey, we got God on our side. If God is for us, who cares who's against us? But he thought, well, why not see what we've got to work with here? Shouldn't have done that, Dave. And he really lets him have it for that. That hardly seems fair. So when the chronicler, long time later, rewrites most of the Deuteronomic history, making some pretty significant changes, when he gets to this, he has the Satan, the adversary, like the prosecutor, he suggested to David to take the military census. And then whammo, it goes the rest of the way the same as in Samuel. How much of a change did he make? Well, I'm guessing if you compare this with Job and Zechariah, where you also have the Satan testing God's supposed champions, that the chronicler thought, well, of course it was God, it was Yahweh who put him up to this, but he has somebody who does that for him. He has the adversary. So it's just a way of distancing God from the dirty work. And there were many attempts to do that by saying, well, God himself didn't actually make the man from the clay. It was an angel. They didn't want God. They were getting a more transcendent idea of God. So they have an intermediary. But he's not a bad guy. He's testing David like he tested Job. Let's see if this guy's what he's supposed to be. And he isn't. So that seems to me, he's like just making a gloss on the text. He's just interpreting it in a way that isn't really a contradiction exactly. He's assuming, well, God used a means to do it. So technically it is, but it seems to me it's a defensible one.
Like, yeah, and I could see Christians easily trying to say, well, one of them just doesn't, when they say God did it, well, what did God do in Job? He used Satan. So behind the scenes, God was actually using Satan, but on the other one, it's explicitly telling you what God was doing in the other account that you didn't know about. And here it is openly being known. But anyway, I didn't want to sidetrack you.
That's exactly what the chronicler meant. And it's viable. I mean, but I don't think the Deuteronomic historian had that in mind. So it is a contradiction, but it's not as ridiculous as the other ones are. And somehow, I don't know what to make of that, really. But
hey guys, I hope you enjoyed the Old Testament Contradictions with Dr. Robert M.Price. Be sure to go down and subscribe to my channel, MythVision Podcast. Like this video, share this video, and go down and show Dr. Bob some love. He's trying to get his YouTube channel going. The link is in the description. And if you guys would be so kind and want to hear from certain scholars, make sure you email me. I've received some of your emails, so don't be thinking I've ignored you. I've been busy trying to juggle multiple things right now. Dr. Luther will be back, so be on the lookout for that as well. I really appreciate you guys who've shown kindness to this channel and everything you do to contribute and help me keep pushing this content. It really helps me go a long ways. Love you guys, and thanks a lot. MythVision Podcast.